They say clothes make the man, but nobody ever tells you that sometimes a ragged piece of fabric is the perfect trap to catch a rat. It was a Tuesday, October the 12th, and the chill off Lake Michigan was already biting through the glass of the Sterling Building's main lobby. I was on my knees on the cold marble floor right down there at the intersection of Wacker Drive, right in the beating heart of Chicago. I had a heavy wrench in my hand, fighting with a stubborn pressure valve on one of the lobby's secondary heating units. Thick, black mechanical grease was already working its way into the frayed cuffs of my navy blue jacket. It's a comfortable old thing, the kind of jacket that has seen better decades, let alone days. I like the quiet hum of machinery. It makes sense to me. You turn a bolt, the pressure normalizes. You grease a gear, the friction stops. Human beings are rarely that straightforward. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I'm 64 years old, and if you walked past me that morning, you would have assumed I was just another tired maintenance guy trying to keep a towering skyscraper from freezing over. And you wouldn't be entirely wrong. I do maintain things, but I also happen to own the building. I built my commercial real estate portfolio block by block, deal by quiet deal, over 40 long years. I don't wear tailored suits unless a boardroom absolutely demands it. I drive a 2008 Ford F-150 with a rusted dent in the tailgate because it starts every morning, gets me from point A to point B, and doesn't ask for attention. The money sitting in my holding accounts has 8 figures, but I still prefer my morning coffee brewed strong and carried in a battered steel thermos. It keeps me grounded. But a man can be firmly grounded and still have a terrible blind spot. Mine is my daughter, Clara. Clara is 29, expecting her first child, and unfortunately, she is married to a man who evaluates a person's worth entirely by the logo stamped on their collar. His name is Marcus Thorne. He's 34 years old, currently serving as a regional director for my own firm, though he is firmly convinced he earned that corner office solely through his own staggering genius. Marcus is the kind of man who wears too much expensive cologne and constantly mistakes arrogance for genuine authority. He is an empty suit, always chasing a status he hasn't actually earned. I should have known exactly how the day was going to unfold based on what happened in the parking garage at 8 o'clock that morning. I was walking across the lower concrete level, carrying my heavy metal toolbox, when a sleek, silver Audi came tearing around the corner. It wasn't his personal car. It was a luxury lease, paid for by a company expense account he thought no one at corporate was actively monitoring. Marcus was behind the wheel, an expensive phone pressed tight to his ear. He saw me. I know for a fact he saw me. He recognized the old navy jacket and the gray hair, and instead of slowing down, he deliberately tapped the gas pedal. He steered his tires close to a shallow drainage puddle, sending a spray of dirty, oily water splashing right over my steel-toed boots. He didn't hit the brakes. He didn't roll down the window to apologize. He just threw a cruel smirk in his rearview mirror and parked in a reserved VIP spot. A younger man might have shouted after him. A prouder man might have chased the car down right then and there. But I learned a long time ago that the loudest voice in a room is rarely the one that wins. So I stayed quiet. I just wiped my boots with an old rag, picked up my thermos, and went to work. I had let Marcus play his little games for 3 years because Clara loved him. She was carrying my grandchild, always making soft excuses for his late nights, his sharp tongue, and his constant need to belittle others. She told me he was just under a lot of pressure at the office. You endure a lot of indignities to keep your daughter smiling. You swallow your pride. You let a hollow man pretend he's a king, just to keep the peace in her home. Back in the lobby, the morning rush was shifting into the afternoon lull. Chicago businessmen and women in sharp wool coats hurried past, their leather shoes clicking sharp rhythms against the marble. Nobody pays attention to an older man on his knees fixing a radiator. You become invisible to them. I actually like being invisible. You see exactly who people are when they think nobody of consequence is watching. It was 1:15. I had finally finished securing the valve panel and was dusting the debris off my knees. I reached for my thermos to pour a cup of that harsh, black coffee. That was when the heavy glass revolving doors spun rapidly, bringing a gust of crisp autumn air into the lobby. Marcus walked in. He wasn't alone. He was flanking 3 older men in bespoke Italian suits, important potential clients from out of state. They were the kind of big fish Marcus desperately needed to land to secure his inflated end-of-year bonus. He was laughing, projecting that booming, artificial confidence he wore like cheap armor. He gestured grandly toward the high ceilings of the lobby, playing the role of the big-shot executive welcoming guests to his domain. And then his eyes scanned the floor. They stopped on me. He saw the thick black grease on my hands. He saw the battered toolbox resting by my boots. He saw the stained blue jacket. The charismatic smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust. What I didn't know yet was that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his professional life, and he was going to do it in front of an audience. There is a very specific kind of swagger a man adopts when he is desperately trying to prove he belongs in a room. Marcus had it perfected. As he led his 3 guests across the vast expanse of polished Italian marble, his voice echoed off the 30-foot vaulted ceilings of the Sterling building. He was talking about quarterly yields and market share, throwing out corporate buzzwords with the casual arrogance of a man playing with someone else's money. The grandfather clock near the concierge desk chimed the quarter hour. It was exactly 1:15 p.m. The lobby had thinned out, leaving the space cavernous and quiet. I was just screwing the cap back onto my thermos, having poured myself a meager half cup of coffee to finish out the task. I fully expected Marcus to walk right past me, to pretend he didn't know the greasy, gray-haired man kneeling by the radiator. After all, acknowledging a blue-collar worker didn't fit the high-roller image he was trying to sell to these out-of-state executives. But Marcus couldn't help himself. He saw an opportunity. He saw a man in a stained work jacket and thought, here is a prop. Here is a perfectly safe target to demonstrate my authority. He stopped abruptly, causing the 3 men behind him to halt. He pointed a perfectly manicured, heavy-ringed finger at a scuff mark on the marble near my steel-toed boots, a mark that had likely been there since the winter of 2018. "Hey, you!" Marcus barked. The sharp sound cracked through the open space like a whip. The 3 executives looked mildly uncomfortable. They shifted their weight, clutching their expensive leather briefcases. I stood up slowly. The joints in my knees pop a bit at 64, but I stood tall. I held my small metal cup of coffee in my left hand, my wrench still resting on the floor. I looked Marcus directly in the eyes. "Look at this," Marcus demanded, gesturing vaguely at the floor. "This is entirely unacceptable. This is a premium corporate environment, not a suburban warehouse. Are you deaf? Get a buffer and clean it up immediately." He was putting on a show. One of his guests, a silver-haired man from Houston, gave me a sympathetic, embarrassed glance. But Marcus was entirely blind to the room's actual temperature. He was intoxicated by the sound of his own voice. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I didn't scramble for a rag. I didn't lower my gaze. I just watched him. Perhaps it was the complete lack of fear in my eyes that infuriated him. His face flushed, a tight red color creeping over his starched white collar. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to use his youth and height to intimidate me. He leaned in, lowering his voice just enough so only I and his guests could hear the venom dripping from his words. "Look at you in that pathetic old suit," Marcus sneered, his lip curling in undisguised revulsion. "Don't speak to my guests. You're just a janitor. Know your place before I have you fired." And then he did it, with a casual, dismissive flick of his wrist. As if he were swatting away a bothersome insect, he struck my left hand. The metal cup tipped. Hot, black coffee splashed heavily across my chest. It soaked instantly into the frayed fabric of my old navy jacket, running down the front in dark, jagged streaks. The metal cup clattered loudly onto the marble floor, rolling away in the sudden, shocking silence. A heavy stillness fell over the lobby. I felt the heat of the liquid seeping through my shirt, pressing against my skin. There's a kind of stillness that comes when you stop needing to be understood. I'd found mine years ago. I'd watched men twice my size lose their entire empires because they couldn't control their pride in a crucial second. I wasn't about to make that mistake. I looked down at the dark stain blooming on my jacket. This was the man sharing a bed with my daughter. This was the man who was going to raise my grandchild. For 3 years, I had smiled at Thanksgiving dinners and paid for their vacations just to keep the peace. The coffee stain wasn't just ruined fabric. It was the final, undeniable proof of the rot inside Marcus Thorne. Very slowly, I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a clean, cotton handkerchief. I dabbed at the coffee on my jacket, methodical and completely unhurried. Marcus stood there, his chest puffed out, waiting for an apology. He was waiting for the poor, broken janitor to cower, apologize, and wipe the floor. I finished wiping my jacket. I folded the handkerchief neatly and returned it to my pocket. I looked back up at Marcus. I gave him a very slow, very deliberate nod. A nod that simply communicated, I see exactly who you are. I bent down, retrieved my fallen cup, and picked up my heavy metal toolbox. I didn't spare another glance for the clients. I didn't look at Marcus again. I simply turned my back on them and walked away. But I didn't head for the maintenance closet. I walked straight past the gleaming glass elevators that ferried the executives. I walked down a narrow, unlit service corridor to the heavy, reinforced steel doors of the freight elevator, the one strictly reserved for cargo and building staff. I stepped inside. The heavy doors rumbled shut, cutting off the bright, artificial lights of the lobby. I stood alone in the dim metal box. I reached out a grease-stained finger and pressed the button. Not for the basement, not for the ground floor. I pressed the button for the 34th floor, the executive suite, the board of directors. The time for hiding in plain sight was over. The freight elevator groaned its way up the spine of the building, a slow, industrial grind that felt a world away from the classical music piped into the guest lifts. I watched the digital floor indicator tick upward. 20, 25, 30. With every passing floor, the tired maintenance man shed a layer of his disguise, and the chairman of the board stepped back into his skin. When the heavy doors parted on the 34th floor, the smell of machine oil and ozone was instantly replaced by the scent of lemon polish and old money. This was the executive level. The carpets were thick, sound-absorbing wool. The walls were lined with dark mahogany and muted abstract art. The hushed silence of real, insulated power hung in the air. I stepped out, my steel-toed boots leaving faint, damp tracks on the pristine rug. A young executive assistant sitting behind a sprawling marble desk looked up, her eyes widening in alarm. She opened her mouth, likely to ask how a lost janitor had bypassed security. I didn't give her the chance. I walked straight past her desk, pushed open the heavy double doors of the chief operating officer's suite without knocking, and clicked the lock shut behind me. Sarah Jenkins didn't flinch. She was sitting behind a massive oak desk, reviewing a quarterly tax projection. Sarah had been my right hand for 15 years. She was a brilliant, fiercely loyal woman who understood the architecture of a corporate takedown better than anyone I had ever met. She was the only person in this branch who knew exactly who I was. She looked up, her sharp eyes scanning my face, then dropping to the large, dark stain ruining the front of my jacket. She slowly closed her laptop. "Arthur," she said, her voice steady and professional, "you appear to be leaking coffee." "It's not my coffee," I replied, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. "Is the audit finished?" For the past 2 months, I had asked Sarah to quietly look into Marcus's division, not because I wanted to catch him, but because part of me desperately hoped I was wrong about him. I wanted to see clean ledgers. I wanted to believe that Clara's husband, despite his insufferable arrogance, was at least a competent, honest provider. Sarah didn't say a word. She unlocked her bottom drawer and pulled out a thick, red manila folder, sliding it across the polished oak surface. I walked over, picked it up, and opened it. Numbers are beautiful things because they have no ego. They don't posture in lobbies, and they don't wear cheap cologne. They just tell the truth. And the truth sitting in that folder was ugly. "Layer 1, Sarah said quietly, pointing to a highlighted column. "Over the last 6 months, Marcus has billed $40,000 to the corporate card under the vague umbrella of marketing assets and client entertainment." I pulled the vendor receipts. It wasn't marketing. It was a high-end boutique down on Oak Street, diamond pendants, tennis bracelets. I stared at the numbers. Clara hadn't worn a new piece of jewelry since her wedding day. "And the delivery address?" "Layer 2, Sarah continued, her tone dropping a fraction of an inch into disgust. "None of it went to your daughter's house. It was couriered to a luxury high-rise on the north side. A woman named Elena signed for every package." My jaw tightened. A cold, heavy stone settled in the bottom of my stomach. My little girl was at home, 4 months pregnant, painting a nursery and making excuses for a man who was stealing from her family to fund a secret life across town. But Marcus wasn't just a cheat. He was a parasite. And parasites always get greedy. "Turn to the last page, Arthur," Sarah instructed softly. I flipped the heavy cardstock. It was a copy of a financial requisition form. Marcus had initiated the paperwork to liquidate a private retirement trust. A trust I had set up for Clara when she was a teenager. He was attempting to drain her nest egg, nearly $200,000, to funnel into a high-risk offshore crypto venture that was already collapsing. And at the bottom of the page was Clara's signature. Only, It wasn't her signature. I knew the loop of her C. I had watched her learn to write it at the kitchen table 20 years ago. Marcus had forged his pregnant wife's name to steal her future. The sorrow of a father gave way entirely. It evaporated, leaving behind the cold, crystalline clarity of a man who builds empires and destroys liabilities. He hadn't just insulted an old man in a lobby. He had declared war on my family. I looked down at the coffee stain on my jacket. I ran my thumb over the damp fabric. "Sarah," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Are his client meetings still going on in the glass conference room downstairs?" "They just ordered lunch," she replied, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "He has them booked for another hour." I reached across the desk and picked up the polished black internal phone. I dialed the head of building security. "If you've ever had to protect your child from someone they blindly loved, hit that subscribe button, because what I did next wasn't just about business. It was an execution." I held the heavy black receiver of the internal phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone while the connection routed to the basement. I didn't speak immediately. My eyes dropped to the lock screen on my personal cell phone, which was resting near the edge of Sarah's massive oak desk. It was a picture from last Christmas. Clara was wearing an oversized sweater, smiling brightly, leaning her head against Marcus's shoulder. He was looking at the camera with that practiced, hollow grin. My thumb brushed over the glass screen, right over her smiling face. In business, raw anger is a liability. It makes you sloppy. It makes you rush. But the cold, calculated protective instinct of a father? That is the most dangerous fuel on earth. Precision is the only thing that matters when you are dismantling a threat to your family. "Security desk, this is Miller," a gruff voice answered on the other end of the line. "Miller, this is Arthur Pendleton," I said, my voice quiet and completely flat. There was a split second of silence before the chief of security's tone shifted into rigid military professionalism. "Yes, Master Pendleton. What do you need?" "I need a soft lockdown on all access points for Marcus Thorne," I instructed, watching Sarah pull a stack of thick legal paper from her secure printer. "I want his corporate ID deactivated across the entire grid. Disable his parking garage pass. Freeze his elevator privileges. I want him boxed into the second floor. And Miller?" "Yes, sir. Send 2 of your quietest, largest men to the second-floor glass conference room. Tell them to stand by the water fountain in the hall. They do not enter until I give the nod." "Understood, sir. Initiating now." I hung up the phone. By the time I turned back around, Sarah had arranged 3 distinct documents on the desk. They were beautifully formatted, dense with legal clauses, and absolute in their power. When you remove an executive of Marcus's level, the documentation has to be utterly airtight, especially when family is involved. "Document 1, Sarah said, tapping the first page with a silver pen. "Immediate termination for cause. We are citing gross financial misconduct, embezzlement of company funds, and breach of fiduciary duty. This nullifies his severance package entirely. He leaves with nothing." I picked up the pen and signed my name. The stroke was heavy, deliberate, and final. "Document 2, she continued, sliding the next paper forward. "Immediate asset recovery. We take back the corporate phone, the laptop, and the keys to the leased Audi currently parked in your VIP spot downstairs." I signed the second page. "And document 3, Sarah finished, a hint of grim satisfaction in her voice. "The immediate freezing of all his corporate expense accounts, alongside a temporary emergency injunction from our legal team freezing his access to Clara's trust fund, pending a full police investigation for forgery." I signed the third page. In less than 2 minutes, with less than an ounce of ink, I had completely erased the empire Marcus Thorne thought he had built. He was no longer a regional director. He was a trespasser in my building, carrying stolen property. Sarah gathered the papers, slipping them into a slim, black leather portfolio. She looked up at me, her eyes sweeping over the dark, jagged coffee stain that was still damp on my chest. The smell of cheap roasted beans and machine oil was strong in the pristine office. "Arthur," she said gently, gesturing toward an armoire in the corner. "I keep a spare suit jacket of yours in the closet. Do you want to change before we go down there?" I looked down at the ruined navy fabric. I felt the sticky moisture against my shirt. I thought about the arrogant flick of his wrist in the lobby. I thought about the diamond necklace delivered to a strange woman's apartment. "No," I said, buttoning the top button of the stained jacket. "This is exactly what I need to wear. I want him to look at this stain while I take everything away from him." Sarah nodded once, understanding completely. She picked up the black portfolio. "Shall we, Mr. Chairman?" We walked out of the suite, bypassing the freight elevator this time. We stepped into the executive glass elevator, the one reserved exclusively for top-tier management and high-profile clients. The doors glided shut, sealing us in the polished chrome car. Through the glass floor of the elevator, I could see the atrium of the building falling away beneath my boots. The invisible trap had already been sprung. Deep in the server rooms, Marcus's digital footprint was being systematically erased. Down in the garage, a tow truck was likely already backing up to his expensive silver lease. He just didn't know it yet. He was a dead man walking, eating catered sandwiches in a glass box. As the elevator doors slid open silently on the second floor, I could hear the faint, booming sound of his laughter echoing down the marble hallway. He was still putting on his show. He was still playing king. He had exactly 3 minutes left on his reign. The carpet on the second-floor executive wing was thick enough to swallow the heavy thud of my steel-toed boots. As Sarah and I turned the corner, I spotted Miller's 2 security guards standing perfectly still near the marble water fountain. They were large, quiet men in dark suits. I gave them a single, subtle nod. They didn't move a muscle, just stood by, waiting for the invisible tripwire to snap. At the end of the hall was Conference Room B, a sprawling fishbowl constructed entirely of thick, soundproof glass. It was designed for transparency, meant to showcase high-level deals to anyone walking past. Today, it was going to showcase a very different kind of transaction. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was exactly 1:42 p.m. Less than 30 minutes ago, I was kneeling on the floor of the lobby. Through the glass, I could see Marcus. He was standing at the head of a massive mahogany table, bathed in the glow of a projection screen displaying a series of aggressively inflated quarterly projections. The 3 executives from Houston were seated around the table, nodding thoughtfully as they picked at plates of catered cedar plank salmon and grilled asparagus. Marcus was completely in his element. He was aggressively adjusting the cuffs of his shirt to make sure his expensive, financed Rolex caught the light. He was a king holding court in his glass castle, utterly convinced of his own supremacy. I reached out, gripped the heavy brushed steel handle, and pushed the door open. I didn't knock. I just walked right in. The airtight seal broke with a soft hiss, and the booming, confident cadence of Marcus's pitch immediately flooded my ears. Sarah stepped in right behind me, pushing the heavy glass door shut. The heavy click of the latch echoed like a dropped anvil in the room. Marcus froze mid-sentence. The red dot of his laser pointer trembled violently, sliding off the projection screen and dancing erratically against the far wall. He stared at me. He took in the heavy work boots, the grease ingrained in the knuckles of my hands, and the dark, jagged coffee stains still clinging wetly to the chest of my frayed navy jacket. The sheer audacity of his father-in-law, the lowly, embarrassing maintenance man. Interrupting his career-defining pitch simply short-circuited his brain. He couldn't process it. His face flushed a deep, furious crimson. "Arthur? What the hell are you doing in here?" Marcus snapped, entirely dropping the polished executive persona. He shot a mortified, apologetic look to the Houston executives, who were staring at me in absolute bewilderment. "I am so sorry, gentlemen. My father-in-law seems to be lost. He works in the basement." He turned his attention back to me, lowering his voice to a vicious, threatening hiss. "Get out, now, before I have building security drag you out by your collar." He reached across the table and aggressively slammed his hand down on the silver intercom button. "Security. I need a forced removal in Conference Room B immediately." Nothing happened. There was no crackle of static, no gruff voice answering, just the faint, mechanical hum of the overhead projector. He pressed it again, jabbing the button repeatedly, his panic starting to leak through. "Security!" "They aren't going to answer, Marcus," Sarah said smoothly, stepping out from behind my shoulder. Marcus finally registered that the chief operating officer was standing in the room. His arrogant sneer faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. "Sarah? What is going on? Why are you in here with him? We're in the middle of a major pitch." Sarah walked forward, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor surrounding the conference table. She didn't look at him with anger. She looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment of a surgeon about to amputate a rotting limb. She stopped at the edge of the mahogany table and unclasped her black leather portfolio. "Marcus," Sarah said, her voice ringing out crisp and clear, "allow me to formally introduce Arthur Pendleton, chairman of the board, majority voting shareholder of this corporation, and the sole owner of the Sterling building. I watched the exact moment his reality shattered. It is a fascinating, terrifying thing to witness a man's entire worldview collapse in real time. The flushed red anger instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw went slack. He looked at Sarah, desperately searching for a punchline to a joke that didn't exist. Then, his eyes slowly dragged back to me. He looked at the coffee stain on my jacket, the stain he had deliberately caused 30 minutes ago. The horrifying realization crashed over him. He hadn't just humiliated a blue-collar worker to impress his clients. He had openly assaulted the man who owned the air he was breathing. I walked toward him. I didn't rush. I took my time, letting the weight of my presence settle heavily on his chest. I stopped directly across from him. "You've had a very busy morning, Marcus," I said. I didn't raise my voice. True power doesn't need to shout to be heard. "Over the last 6 months, you used company funds to purchase $40,000 worth of jewelry for a woman named Elena who lives on the north side. That is corporate embezzlement." The 3 Houston executives stopped chewing. They slowly set their silver forks down, their eyes darting between me and the trembling man at the head of the table. "Worse," I continued, my tone dropping into a cold, flat absolute. "You forged my pregnant daughter's signature on a financial requisition form to liquidate her private trust fund, attempting to cover a failing offshore investment." "Arthur, Dad, wait," Marcus stammered. His slick, booming voice had vanished completely, replaced by a thin, breathless wheeze. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the whiteboard. I reached into Sarah's open portfolio and slid the 3 documents across the polished mahogany. They came to a stop right in front of his trembling hands. "You are fired for cause, effective immediately," I stated, tapping the first document. "Your severance is nullified. Your corporate credit accounts have been frozen. Your access to Clara's accounts is currently locked under an emergency legal injunction, and your leased Audi is currently being chained to a tow truck in my parking garage." The men from Houston didn't need to hear another word. They quietly stood up, snapped their briefcases shut, and walked out of the glass room without making a single sound. They didn't even look at Marcus as they passed him. The big fish were gone. The pond was empty. Marcus collapsed back into his expensive leather chair. He looked at the legal documents, the undeniable, airtight proof of his total ruin. The Rolex on his wrist suddenly looked incredibly heavy. He stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes, all his artificial bravado stripped away, leaving only a hollow, frightened boy. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can fix this. I can pay it back. Just, please don't do this. I'm family." I looked down at the man who had lied to my daughter. I looked at the dark coffee stain ruining my favorite old jacket. "I might be a janitor, Marcus," I said softly, "but right now, I'm taking out the trash." I didn't wait for him to find another excuse. I simply turned my head and gave a small nod through the glass. The heavy door hissed open again. Miller and his partner stepped inside. They were seasoned professionals, polite but entirely immovable. They handed Marcus a standard issue, medium-sized cardboard box. They informed him, in very calm, steady voices, that he had exactly 5 minutes to empty his desk of personal items. No corporate assets, no laptops, just his framed photos and whatever fragments of his ego he could carry. I didn't stay to watch him pack. I didn't need to gloat. I had a building to run, and far more importantly, I had a daughter to talk to. Sarah stayed behind to oversee the final legal protocols, ensuring every digital and physical door was locked behind him. Later, Miller told me exactly how the exit went down. They walked Marcus back through the main lobby. It was the exact same stretch of marble where he had stood an hour earlier, loudly trying to humiliate a maintenance man for the amusement of his guests. He didn't look at anyone this time. He kept his head ducked low, his face pale, clutching his little cardboard box tight to his chest. When they escorted him out to the VIP parking garage, the spot where his silver Audi usually sat was completely empty, save for a few stray drops of motor oil. The tow truck had been highly efficient. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised gray, and it had started to rain, that sharp, freezing Chicago drizzle that cuts right through a thin dress shirt. With his corporate cards frozen, his phone confiscated, and his pride utterly shattered, Marcus Thorne had to walk 3 blocks in the freezing downpour to wait for a city bus. But the hardest part of the day wasn't firing Marcus. It was the conversation that happened at 7 o'clock that evening in my own home. The contrast from the cold, Sterile glass of the corporate boardroom to the warm, quiet wood of my kitchen was jarring. I had finally taken off the ruined navy jacket. I was wearing an old, comfortable flannel shirt, standing at the stove, slowly stirring a pot of chicken and wild rice soup. It was an old family recipe, the kind of meal that fills a house with a sense of safety and warmth. Clara sat at the butcher block island behind me. The printed copies of the jewelry receipts, the photograph of the luxury apartment, and the forged trust documents sat on the wood between us. I hadn't sugarcoated it, but I hadn't used harsh words either. I had simply laid out the truth, piece by undeniable piece, letting the numbers speak for themselves. I waited for the denial. I waited for her to defend him. But she didn't. She looked at the forged signature on the trust document. The money meant for her unborn child's future. And the final illusion of Marcus Thorne simply dissolved. She didn't scream. She didn't throw things. She just broke down. It was the quiet, heavy weeping of a woman realizing the man she had loved, the man she was building a family with, was entirely hollow. I turned off the burner on the stove. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, walked around the island, and pulled my daughter into my arms. She buried her face in my shoulder, sobbing into the flannel fabric. I just held her. My rough, calloused hands, the hands of a mechanic, a father, and a chairman, gently rubbed her back. I didn't offer empty platitudes. I just told her that she was safe. I promised her that she and the baby would always be protected, and that she would never have to worry about a roof over her head or a warm meal on her table again. It would take time to heal. The legal untangling of their marriage would be messy, but Sarah and my legal team were already building an impenetrable fortress around Clara's assets. The storm would pass. She was a Pendleton, and we are built to weather harsh seasons. Later that night, long after she had eaten and finally fallen asleep in her childhood bedroom, I sat alone on the back porch, watching the rain fall over the dark lawn. I thought about the hollow man standing at the bus stop, stripped of his title, his car, and his stolen wealth. Status is just a borrowed coat. Character is the skin you wear underneath when the coat is stripped away. What would you have done if it were your daughter sitting at that kitchen island? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe true power doesn't need to shout to be heard, tap that like button.